For today's podcast, we're going to be going over budget issues. This is a series we had a while back with it, but we're going to be visiting the second part of it. In this case, we're going to be going on the idea of, do we need aid at all? And before we get to that, I'm asking people to generously consider becoming a patron to my Patreon page, and it's www.patreon.com/challengehistory, and it starts at $1, goes $1, $10, $25, $50, and $100. There's a future levels for the there's future contests for people at the $50 and $100 levels. 50 is a silver Roman coin, and $100 levels is a gold Byzantine coin. This will be when we hit basically 5 people of each of the levels, and that'll be on the yearly thing. And for each 5 people we add on those levels, it will drop it on. When we get up to 10, it'll make it every 6 months. I'll do a giveaway, and then then we get it up to 20, we'll make it every 3 months. Then if we get up to 60 in each of the in the groups with it, we'll do like a monthly giveaway then. For that, for the other groups with it, it will depend when I figure out what giveaway I want to do. If those grow like at massive rates, then I will consider something quite nice, but that would be on like a yearly basis. That obviously it would start with, for if it was something big, but otherwise it would be something a lot smaller than those 2 items, because those 2 are for people that are donating quite a lot during the year. The 25 is, you're talking about $400 a year, or sorry, the $50 is about $600 a year, or no, about $600 a year for those people, and the $100 is $1,200 a year donation, and that's quite a lot of money that people are donating. So I want to at least kind of pay back random one person per year in the donations on that when we're doing that. And you'll also see what I'm actually, my actual story a little bit better behind this, behind just knowing that I'm on disability for my back and for OCD. You'll see a little more behind my story with it on when you go to the page, and you'll see a little bit of an intro letter that I wrote on the February 23rd, and then for each level with it, you'll kind of get an idea of what each one is, for what it kind of gives you for benefits. And then as more people start to add in with it, I'll start to put in more benefits for each level. And I for any people who donate with, I really do appreciate even the smallest donation, even just that $1 donation per month, which is just $12 per year, which is really not much money, but it really helps me along the way. Because being on disability with you don't get much money per year, and I really want to be able to earn money on my own to basically do this. And currently I'm not at advertiser levels, so I need to be able to supplement my income. Now into the idea of this topic, I should say. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the where this comes from. We're actually going to go and look at our actual document for the Constitution, and we're going to take a strict determination on the Constitution itself, and that would go into Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. This provides for the actual legislative powers that they have, and this is basically where you're going to find that point of where there is, and that goes into the first section. Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay for the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. Now, this term for the general welfare of the United States has been actually abused, because when we check out the term of welfare in the actual meaning itself, it means a state of well-doing, especially in respect for good fortune, happiness, well-being, and prosperity. Now, when they mean in general welfare, they mean actually through an economic system. They mean that basically there's not an actual unfair system that basically creates, such as crony capitalism, which means we're basically where the government's picking the winners and losers, and where basically there's a system of where there is such things where they're not giving away free stuff either. With it, that did not mean that either, because that's been a bastardized version, and that's a totally different meaning on the term of welfare, and that's actually a modern version of the word. If we look at synonyms, it means good, interest, weal, and well-being. It does not mean anything else. And this is for the full reason that if you look at before the idea of the Johnson administration, before even the earliest forms of welfare were actually from the Progressive era, of what they were doing for actually these welfare programs. Not actually the welfare of the citizens, as it states here, the general welfare of the citizens of the United States, but actually the welfare programs, which have nothing to do with the general welfare. But those were established by during the Progressive era, mainly during the FDR administration. Then you had later this idea of welfare was expanded. This new definition was expanded during the 1960s under Lyndon Baines Johnson, and it was basically to pander for votes, and that was its sole purpose. And that was the whole idea. But when the term of general welfare with it, if you look at previous, they had never offered any actual finances in this method. There was no actual welfare payments per se to any people. The idea that they had before was theoretically to have a pure, unadulterated capitalist system. And this is what their idea was for the general welfare of the United States. And this was the actual whole idea that they wanted. And this is why they put it in with the common defense. And there was common defense of the United States as well. And this was also a term that was actually bastardized as well. And they termed of the common defense to mean a larger area as well. And this is where we get to the idea of foreign aid, because foreign aid has nothing to do with any of this general welfare nor the common defense. And that's something that we need to understand. And this is something that is not even anywhere in the Constitution. No foreign aid is even part of the constitutional allowance. And they don't have they're not in the business of charity, because welfare is not charity. Welfare is completely different, and this is where you actually get the definitions. And they found the definitions to be different, and government was never supposed to be in that business. And the welfare was just basically to make sure that there was equality between people, make sure there was the actual system remained fair. And the way that you do this is make sure that you're not essentially picking winners and losers. And you pick winners and losers in what you call a crony capitalist system. This is where you're creating regulations which make it hard for small business to win, such as minimum wage. This makes it more difficult for them to win. More regulations, which make startup companies more difficult to actually start up, which are actually lobbied by bigger companies. That's part of crony capitalism. When you do corporate welfare, that's more crony capitalism, and that is again part of welfare in the modern sense, which means you're giving out money that should never be given out. We were seeing this when I was talking about the idea of money being given to such as things as was being talked by John Stossel, is money being given to sugar growers. These are wealthy American sugar growers. We say, we need to subsidize it so these foreign sugar growers that are being subsidized don't beat out the sales of the American sugar growers. Well, the fact is you're hurting the American consumer. And the idea with it is not for the government to pick winners and losers, but for the actual, just the general welfare of the system, which means of the United States, which meant to essentially just allow for pure capitalism. That's all it meant, and pure capitalism was the only fair system. It meant for voluntary exchange, and that's what they knew it meant. And they didn't, and it meant so people could actually voluntarily exchange goods and services with one another and use a medium of gold and silver, which was essentially regulated through the United States and set forth for values by weights. And there was no fiat currency. That was not legal for United States tender. As if you start reading the actual Constitution, that's not a legal tender, because it said specifically to coin money. Now, when we're talking about the actual system of what the actual system is with it when dealing with other countries, what Congress has is to regulate commerce with foreign nations. That's basically what that meant on the term regulate, was essentially to essentially arrange. It didn't mean to limit, it meant to arrange. Now, when they're talking about regulate, it merely meant to arrange between these areas. This is the same term as you find in the Second Amendment. It did not mean to restrict. And this is the whole thing that a lot of people today misinterpret on the actual term of where we see the word regulate. They think it means to actually restrict and create red tape. It does not mean anywhere close to that. It is not. That's the modern meaning. The actual original meaning was is actually closer to what the military meaning was to essentially create order. And to create order would mean to essentially make it easier for companies to deal with these other companies overseas, and especially back then, it was a lot harder for them to deal with these people, to deal with these entities. Such as that's why they wanted to create some type of uniform system for them to deal with foreign nations, and then with states to deal with other states, to make sure the states were not were basically abiding by the rules of not putting tariffs on other ones, because that was essentially violating the law. And then with Indian tribes, to make sure that there was a uniform system as well. And this is basically all it was. the reason why we know this is when we look at the term to coin money, and it says regulate the value thereof. It doesn't mean to restrict the value. It means to just basically to standardize. And that's all what we're talking about. Because the term standard meant something completely different than it does now. Standard meant a certain level of quality, whereas regulate meant to actually create a standard or create a certain level of order. And that's something that needs to be understood. So when we're talking about doing now the first question is we need to answer is the idea of aid even constitutional? Now, if we understand the actual Constitution in itself, we should actually answer is no. No, it is not, because that is not the role of government. The role of government is not to be essentially picking winners and losers. It was actually meant to create the system to ensure a fairness between people, that they could actually deal with one another as in a voluntary manner, and the government was not to essentially create where certain people had the ability where they can get free things and have special privileges that others were not, and others were essentially had this system to where they were hampered because of merely because they were earning too much income, but were not essentially gifted enough to get more income from the government or more access to the government because they did not they were not high enough on the ladder, being a special company. And this is what we find here, and that's essentially what the general welfare was the United States was to eliminate, was to stop this stuff from happening. It was not to give out free money. It was basically to stop these special deals from happening. They didn't want it. That was to eliminate all special deals. There were supposed to be no contracts. There were no contracts back then. You weren't saying, oh, we need these defense contracts, and we need these special contracts here from this part, and we need these special contracts here from these part. Well, you're picking winners and losers instead of actually just buying per piece, as you would need them, as any voluntary contract would, as any voluntary interaction would suit. You're actually basically picking winners and losers. And you're not acting as an actual voluntary interaction would suit, because the fact is you're basically ignoring the actual code of this general welfare of the United States, and then you're giving out this free money to certain companies. You're giving out free money to certain people, and it's basically causing a huge problem. And then you're claiming that it follows the general welfare, but it's doing the exact opposite. Now, when we go to the idea of foreign aid, we're saying, but these are our allies. Well, the fact is you look down here with it, and there's nothing within the actual thing of Congress. Now, when we look in there with it, no one says to provide for the common defense. It says of the United States. That's only the actual states and its territories only. And the term of common defense only meant that. It did not mean it did not mean anything else. So we cannot validate anything else but that. And it said, even when it's saying to raise armies and to raise and support armies, it's not saying anything other than the armies for the military for the United States. And it's saying for appropriation cannot be longer than 2 years. Saying to provide and maintain for a navy, to make rules of the government and regulation for for of the land and naval forces, and it keeps going forward with it. But you see that basically there is no actual set forth of the of basically doing anything for any foreign government, and any links to any foreign government for their military action, or any non-governmental authority such as NATO. It never says anything about them, and them having any link to our military authority involvement, or them being listed as part of a common defense either, because there was never any common defense other than common defense for the United States itself and its own territories. It doesn't even mention anything in Section 9 of anything of that. Section 10 neither as well. Section 10 actually specifically states that actually shows this the gold and silver coin was supposed to be essentially the top level, which essentially for states of paying debts. So that's where we get the idea of that point. Section 2, which shows the executive power, we see that he's basically says he's the head of the military, says he can have advice and consent of Congress to make treaties, power to fill vacancies when they're not in session, and there's basically nothing when it comes down to it. When we see for the actual rules for basically foreign aid, we can go into the actual things on Bill of Rights for this. This would show an actual limitation of their powers, but it would still give some idea of something of their powers. And you see the First Amendment does not give anything on foreign aid. Second Amendment, Third Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth, Sixth, Seventh, Eighth, Ninth, nor 10th. You keep going in the second part with it, which is the additional amendments, which is 11 through 27, and you can see that none of them give any statements that they have this power to do this, even if they allocate the money. They basically do not have this power to do so. That's essentially the power of that was actually meant for the actual role of government would have been for advocating any money of allocating any money would have had to have been privately, and any type of defense goods would have had to have been purchased by those individual countries, and that would be completely separate. The reason why we were never giving out any defensive goods previous to this point, previous to the Progressive Era, was because of the point was that we were actually being a lot more constitutional, and we weren't following this idea of basically ignoring the actual real meaning of the Constitution. They wanted this idea of, on the Progressive Era, was essentially to bastardize it and change around what the meanings of the words meant in its original intention, and change around the common defense of the United States meant the common defense of the globe. So when we look at it, we can see that there's really no purpose for any domestic aid. We can see no purpose for corporate aid or corporate welfare, and we can see no purpose for the idea of foreign aid. Essentially, the only thing we have to worry about is actually running the government itself. And this means when it comes down to it is obviously there's a tough decision on what to do with the Social Security, because essentially people for so many years were forced at gunpoint to put money into it, so it created such a horrible decision with that. So we have this problem currently. But I think we can eventually tend to wind that down eventually and start moving it over to a private system that can allow them to kind of eventually opt out. And I think it's going to happen slowly for this to actually be a little more sound, and eventually kind of start flipping it over to being more private. So it becomes a private handling of their money instead of basically where the government's controlling it. And this is something that's very, very crucial. And this is where we get to where we're at. But because the reason why we go with that one being a little bit touchy is because we need to understand originally Social Security was very unpopular amongst people. This was essentially just roughshod over the people that nobody wanted it to begin with. They felt that they were doing their own savings programs just fine, but what it was the government wanted more control over that, and we got essentially a situation which was much worse, and it forced people to essentially have their money stolen, and that took a lot of their ability to save out of their hands. And what it ended up doing was it created essentially a Ponzi scheme by the government to essentially have the next generation pay for them, because they knew when inflation hit that there was no possibility to make that money that the first one saved, because there was no actual true investment that was happening. So their hopes were that each previous generation was going to have enough kids to balance the previous generation out. Well, when that changed because of the inflation cost rising, guess what's going to happen is they're not going to have as many kids, because the actual cost for actually raising the children and the actual cost that it puts on the actual economy and what ends up being created is a huge problem. And this was never planned, and it was a complete another brain dead idea just for adding government force. And when we see this is something that was created out of basically trying to take the power away from the actual people and away from them having private savings. And this is why we people who actually like freedom and liberty were actually against that idea, and it was essentially very, very unpopular. Now people in history books that write these progressive history books, and have done it for well over 70 years, have actually tried to create this idea that it was popular from the start, and it was a great idea and everybody loved it, and they'll try to come up with the idea of, the New Deal was automatically successful, and all these lies. Essentially, the New Deal wasn't successful. It was so successful they had to do it again, because the first time was a complete utter failure. Even on the second time, it didn't work. So basically, they end up going to war, and everybody forgot about it. Well, guess what? Even after all of that stuff, we are still in a depression. So so they were basically reliant on the actual excessive production during war to actually kind of bump up the actual economy for output. And that was the only reason why things looked a little slightly better. But it wasn't actually better for the situation for the people. It was actually that the output was actually up. And it was only up for the actual war effort. And it wasn't really, things didn't really get better until you actually had the actual relief on taxes, which came not until basically about 15 years later. and that allowed people to have some bit of relief, of serious relief on their taxation that was under Kennedy. This is why when people try to say Kennedy was a liberal, well, it's not really truly so, because when you look at what he did, he essentially gutted the taxation and reduced it down by a severe amount. I mean, there's no one to date that actually did what Kennedy did when it comes to taxation. When you look at the actual percentages, he essentially cut the stuff in half. And that's why we end up. That's why when people try to say Kennedy would have been a Democrat today. No, Kennedy. I mean, he would be yelling at some of the Republicans for not cutting taxes enough. And where he would actually stand. I mean, JFK was severely conservative. I mean, really, really conservative. For these people like AOC, he'd be rolling his eyes and saying, "What are you talking about? Raising the actual taxation?" And asking for these horribly expensive programs. He would basically want to kill those programs immediately, and probably want to kill a bunch of programs as well because of the actual cost. So this is what we talk about with that. And when it comes down to the idea of aid with it, we really don't need any of this aid. And because if we're going to talk about being constitutional, we need to talk about what it actually means. We only have to defend our own nation. We don't have to defend any other nation than our own. And this is very, very simple. And I know there's a lot of people out there that are going to say, "Oh, but the world will go into disarray." Hate to tell you, but it won't. Because every nation's going to be looking out for its own interest. The other nations are not going to say, "We give up. We're just going to let everybody take us over and it's going to be over." That's not going to be what's going to happen. That's not being realistic. That's completely being irrational. Because trust me, even before we had these other empires, such as even the British Empire, other nations actually look out for their own sovereignty. And this is just what happens. And they're not going to basically say, "We give up." They don't do that. This is just natural what happens. They actually look out for their own sovereignty, and they will fight when people try to take it over. And this is what ends up happening. So, and this is why wars actually start. So what you want to do, you want to eliminate this. And to eliminate this, you're going to have to essentially have all the nations back off. And the way you would do this essentially is you want the U.S. as a superpower to essentially concede all of its bases globally and only worry about its own nation. Now what this would do is this would force any nation receiving aid to essentially have to rely on itself. Now no nation out there could do so. That's been very aggressive militarily. All those nations would essentially have to concede themselves and realize that they're either if they're going to try that, they're going to be running out of supplies very, very fast. And they're going to basically be in a lot of trouble when their opposition is going to be saying, "Hey, you're out of supplies, and we can basically kill you at any time, and you're just sitting ducks." Or they can go in the opposite direction and realize, "Hey, we can't do this anymore, and we can't rely on the U.S. We're going to essentially have to work on peace." And this is what ends up happening. It's the latter is usually what ends up happening, because no nation's that stupid to actually want to kill itself. Very, very few times in history has that happened, that any nation was so stupid that it actually wanted to let itself die and explode itself. Usually what happens when we see a nation actually die out is actually, or an empire die out, is because it ended up pushing itself financially too far. The actual idea of the Roman Empire was that it developed into fiat currency, and it extended its empire too far militarily, And what it was doing was it ended up from a monetary perspective, it developed into fiat currency eventually. It started at gold currency, then on to silver currency, and then it dropped out to a fiat currency, basically meaning paper that was worthless. And that ended up killing their empire. Because they basically, their empire wasn't worth anything, and that's how they ended up dying out. And their whole empire collapsed upon itself. And essentially, the United States could easily be doing itself, could be copying the exact same motive if we keep doing what we're doing. And we're going to have to eventually realize we have to concede on a military basis and let everybody else fend for themselves. Because eventually you can't keep that up. And this is why we look at these questions like aid, all forms of aid, and we want to look at things from a constitutional basis of, is this really what we need? Because the founders had a system set up that was actually perfectly fine, but we have people bastardizing it that don't know what they're talking about. And it doesn't matter if we're talking people on the right or people on the left or wherever. I mean, you have people on the right like Ben Shapiro and Marco Rubio and John Bolton that don't even know what they're talking about, just as much as people on the left like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Cenk Uygur and Anna Kasparian and I forgot the one for Secular Talk, the other one on the Young Turks Network. You have those morons like that talking nonsense as well. I mean, when you have all these people talking nonsense, essentially you're going to lead to a system that's basically going to crash the United States as a country. And if you want the country to last, you're going to have to start cutting all of this stuff. The military empire needs to die. You can't do this anymore. You only can defend the United States as itself. When it comes down to on the corporate welfare, it needs to end 100%, and you need to get rid of the central banking. When it comes down to the actual public aid, it needs to end 100%. I'm sorry, but we can't do this anymore. Our country is basically well over 100% of our GDP, and this includes government spending. And when government spending is a core part of it, and we're on basically a path where we can't pay any of this anymore. A good portion of our actual payments are actual debt, and that's basically just interest payments. We're not paying off any debt. We're just basically getting new loans, and that's all we're doing nowadays. We're not actually doing anything productive. If we were actually doing things productive and paying off loans and getting this stuff back down and doing what we should as a country, we'd be productive. But when we have what Donald Trump is doing, he's just doing exactly what the swamp wants. And he's going, okay, we're going to cut all the other budgets except for military. Well, guess what we're doing? We're essentially doing the exact opposite of what we need to be doing. Because the fact is he's so worried about pumping up the military. Well, we don't need the military pumped up. We need the military shrunk down. He has the military basically most likely headed toward $1 trillion. That's going to be nearly 4 times the amount that's necessary. This is a point that I've made. This is a point that David Stockman has made. I was making this when I was in college, getting both my bachelor's and master's degree, and David Stockman has recently made this point that you only need $250 billion. It doesn't take much of a genius to figure this out. That's all you need. All you need for actual defense. Now, this isn't defense spending. This is empire spending. This is military spending, not actual defense spending. And the last time I heard, it was the Department of Defense. It's not the Department of Military. It's the Department of Defense. All you need to do is defend the United States and its territories. That's it. Nothing more. Nobody else gets any money. When other countries ask for more money, tell them, look elsewhere. We're not spending money on you anymore. And we need to start kicking out all these other people when they start asking for money, because we're not going to start giving out money anymore, because we don't have the money to give out. You're robbing people. That's all they're doing. And these other countries, I mean, you have Israel coming around, you have under AIPAC, you have CARE coming around, which is Saudi Arabia, and they're saying, we need money, we need money, we need money. Well, guess what? Your countries are more wealthier than our own. We have a lot of problems with our own damn country. And it's because you keep coming around, you keep starting more wars, and you keep creating more terrorists in the world, and guess what ends up happening? We have to pay for it. And our budget keeps getting messed up because of those two groups, as well as other lobbyist groups, and we need to start ignoring the lobbyists and actually get down to a constitutional budget that only focuses on the bare necessities. And this is what we need to understand, is there's not much we need from an actual constitutional perspective. And we could actually do it for far less than we're actually spending right now. Now, obviously, we would have to start spending a little bit more initially, because we would need to bring the bases back home, number one, and number two, we would have to spend a little bit more to start buying off the loans, to start bringing back down that the debt. But within time, we're talking the actual debt is going to shrink down, and it's going to be a lot smaller. But we can't keep going on this pace, because the fact is we have a bloated military that's, I mean, it's so large it's not even funny. I mean, people can, and they use the excuse of, Obama gutted the military. Obama never gutted the military. It was basically, basically what it was Obama overextended the military. The solution is bring them home. The whole problem with the military was that it was overextended, not that he gutted it. And by extending the budget, you're not going to fix anything. Same thing with the actual problem with education. You're not going to fix it by tossing money at it. You need to actually look at the real problems. And that's basically what we're looking at here. This is why we look at the actual situation with actual rational thought, and not looking at it with feelings. Because if we looked at it with feelings, we just say, toss more money at it, and we just start saying generic slogans out there that don't make any sense. What we need to look at is actually look at what the actual facts are. It's the military has been growing rapidly over the last about 20 years, and the fact is there is no legitimate reason for that. This is because we've been much more interventionist over this period, and if you look at it, the more intervention we do, the more terrorism grows, and it doesn't impact us positively. And if we basically, from an actual aspect of that, if we want terrorism to shrink, we become less interventionist. And this involves eliminating all public aid, which will basically eliminating all that foreign aid. And a lot of the foreign aid is military foreign aid, and if you start cutting that out, you're going to realize that these nations in the Middle East are going to have to pick what they want to do. And eventually, if we're not there in the region, they're not going to be as apt to attack us. They're going to be attacking those people who essentially are attacking them. They're not going to be interested in attacking people who essentially leave and say it's not worth it. That's not their point. And the argument that, they're attacking us because of our freedom. No, they're not doing that. It's the same reason why we had the death penalty here. It's because of revenge on those who killed their loved ones. That's it. That's the sole reason. When we have our bombings that kill basically 90% of the people killed in a bombing are innocent civilians, that creates a lot of people who are actually angry about the outcome. You're killing a bunch of people, which mean that basically the survivors of those bombings are basically going to say, "I want revenge for this," and those people say, "I want revenge for this." They essentially become terrorists, and they want revenge for what happened to their loved ones, and they basically will join up with other people who have similar situations. And this is what we get. Well, if we stop doing that, you're going to have less of it, and those who are doing these actions are going to have to suffer the consequences. And this is what you're going to see. So when we look at the idea of foreign aid, we can just basically pull it, because frankly, even when we give stuff that's humanitarian aid, it basically either A, comes with strings, or B, it goes to people that basically are never going to help these people out, and it's going to be dished out with strings as well. So it never actually helps. And the best way to actually help out these people is let the actual charity groups do it themselves. We have plenty of charity groups in the United States. We have plenty of charity groups around the globe that do an excellent job of this. Their whole idea of what they actually do is act with humanitarian aid. We don't need any more. If companies want to actually sell military equipment to other countries, let them do so. Let them do so at full cost, and tell these other countries if they want to pay for it, they pay for it at full cost. We're not taking on any of the cost ourselves. And if they want anything else with it, they're going to do so at their own full cost for their country, and we're not going to pay for it. And eventually they're going to realize that basically it's not going to be affordable for them. And they're going to realize it's going to be very, very costly for them to do any business with the United States, because they're not going to get any freebies. And this is how things are supposed to work. And they're going to realize that if they want free stuff, they're going to have to go elsewhere. And eventually you're going to realize that the best the situation that's best for them is going to be guarding their own nation. I mean, they're probably going to accuse the United States of Islamophobia or anti-Semitism or any of these other blanket accusations, but we're going to have ourselves a balanced budget eventually, and a balanced and no more debt, and we're not going to be beholden to any other groups that basically want to control our foreign policy. And this is what's going to happen for that when it comes to our economy. We're going to have eventually an economy that works for everyone. We're not going to have these specific privileged companies that control what we do. We're not going to have defense contractors that go, "Hey, you haven't had a war in a while, you haven't bombed anybody in a while, you need to do that," and they start pushing that. And they start they have their people make up false intelligence of stuff that never happened. And when it comes to domestic aid, we need to start ending that with it, because in a voluntary system, you need people to actually be involved in actual trade with one another and be productive, because otherwise the system doesn't work. And it works best when people are all when able bodies are all available to work and to produce something. And it doesn't matter what they're producing, but all able bodies need to produce. And this is the whole point. And when we have this, you'll see that it will create a system to where it's best for everyone, and those people will see that they'll get so much more out of life, and the government won't be on their backs for anything, and the system will end up being where they will get so much more when it comes to what they can buy in the store, and they won't have to deal with the actual harassment from the government, from local or federal levels, and they'll see that it's the best of both worlds for them. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, make sure you share this all the way around social media. Check out my Patreon page, and make sure that you can, if you can't donate money, make sure that you share it to someone else that maybe could. Bye, everyone.